Welcome to another in the series of Perth US Asia Center Foreign Policy Conversations. Today, we're delighted to have a conversation with Ben Bland, the director for the Southeast Asia program at the Lowy Institute. And we're here to talk about his new book, Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. Now, I have to confess here, we're late in doing so. The book was released last September, and it's been on our list during what was a very tumultuous 6 months. But we're excited to maybe give the book a fresh look in a new year. Ben needs no introduction to most of our audience here in Australia. In addition to his current position at the Lowy Institute as director of the Southeast Asia program, he had a full decade as an award journalist with the Financial Times, had postings in Hanoi, I believe, Hong Kong, if I'm correct, Jakarta, and broad experience reporting across China and Southeast Asia. I cross paths with Ben regularly in international conferences back in the days when he used to travel, but more importantly now on all range of social media, where he continues to opine, not just on social media, but as a commentator in the media more broadly. So Ben, thank you so much for making the time for this conversation today. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Gordon.
Now let's jump right into your book. Great title, Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia. I think Joko might have been hoping for something like Man of Mystery, but Man of Contradictions it is. Can you just give us a little bit of context about the book and what inspired you to focus on the President of Indonesia when there are many other interesting leaders throughout Southeast Asia as well?
Well, as you said, Gordon, I used to be a Financial Times correspondent in Indonesia. I lived in Jakarta for 4 years. And when I moved to Hong Kong, I kept going back to Indonesia as a journalist to visit. And obviously in my new capacity at the Lowy Institute, I've been a regular visitor to Indonesia up and until the pandemic hit and stopped that way of life. So always been fascinated by Indonesian politics. And I think it was just timing. I first moved to Indonesia as a journalist. I'd visited before, but I first moved there as a correspondent in 2012. At that time, Joko Widodo, Jokowi as he's known, was the mayor of Solo, a small city of 500,000 people in central Java, his hometown, and he was running for the governorship of Jakarta. And I got to meet him on the campaign trail. Indonesia is a kind of rambunctious democracy. It's a great place to be a journalist because you can talk to all kinds of people on the ground. There's great access, as we like to say in that business. So I was able to meet him and just track his meteoric rise, because 2 years after I met him as mayor of Solo, he was president of Indonesia, the world's third biggest democracy with 270 million people. So I think it was right place at the right time that I got to make those connections with him, with many of his supporters, ministers, advisors. But also, I just think he's a fascinating character. He came from nowhere so quickly to rise to the top. He has this amazing ability to connect with ordinary Indonesians, and he has this ability really to allow people to paint their own hopes and fears onto him, which is really what propelled him to the top. But it also explains, I think, a lot of the disappointment about his leadership. And I really wanted to try and get to the nub of, who is Jokowi, what sort of leader is he, and what does that tell us about Indonesia. And it happened that no one had written a biography of Jokowi in the English language. There was even very little in Indonesian beyond these very kind of pro-Jokowi hagiographies, if you like. So I thought there's a great sort of opening in the market to try and say something about the man, his backstory, and what that tells us about Indonesia and hopefully where it's heading.
Well, we're all the beneficiary of that. You titled the book Man of Contradictions, and a good chunk of your book focuses on his leadership style. As you just mentioned in your previous answer, he's not a normal Indonesian politician. He doesn't come from money or from a big political family. So would you tell us a little bit about his leadership style and the core things that we need to understand about President Joko Widodo?
Well, the reason I called the book Man of Contradictions is because I was really struggling throughout my research to get a handle on how can you simply describe Jokowi? For the title of a book, you need a phrase that really tries to encapsulate the man. Some people would say man of contradictions is a cop-out, but I would argue that it's not. And actually, the phrase came from one of his ministers. In one of our many conversations, we were chatting about, how can we make sense of Jokowi's shifts on various different issues? And, the minister said to me, well, ultimately, he's a bundle of contradictions, like many of us. So if you look at some of the things Jokowi has been called, Time magazine famously put him on the cover and said he was the new hope for democracy. He's been called a reformer, a technocrat, a developmentalist, a nationalist, an authoritarian even. And I think there's a little bit of truth in all these labels, but none of them quite gets to the heart of Jokowi. And Jokowi himself is not a man who likes isms. He was never interested in politics as a young man. He never dreamt of being Indonesia's leader. He doesn't read much about politics. He doesn't read much at all. He's a leader really guided by practical experience. And I think we have to understand here his background, coming from humble origins, building his own small furniture exporting business, and then working as the mayor of his hometown for a number of years, winning 2 terms there. I think it was that practical experience of building furniture, learning how to deal with workers, with foreign clients to sell his exports to, learning how to manage the practical problems of a city. It's those experiences that really shaped how he leads, which is very practical. It's very hands-on. It's very day-to-day. And I think one of the things that we've seen is he's risen up the power structure from leader of a small city to governor of Jakarta, a city of 30 or 40 million people. If you look at the greater metropolitan area, to president of the nation, he's really struggled to scale up this approach, because this practical hands-on approach works well. Running a small furniture business, running a small city, it's much harder when you're leading a country of 270 million people, so many islands, so many diverse peoples, languages, and so many different structures of government, both at the central level and, of course, massive decentralization that's occurred in Indonesia since the fall of Suharto in 1998.
There's a saying that no man is an island. I presume that's particularly true in Indonesia, where you have 17,000 islands in the country. But out of this population of 270 million people, obviously there's a lot of people around Jokowi who have been part of this story. Could you help us understand that ecosystem, if you will, around President Jokowi?
Well, just as a brief aside on the island question, people talk about 17,000. Indonesia actually doesn't know how many islands it has. And they have a unit at the Ministry of Fisheries that's actually out there going to all these extremely located tiny islets and islands, trying to count them, trying to make sure they're named properly, and then registering those names with the UN. So Indonesia is still trying to work that out, which I think gets to the heart of some of the infrastructure and governance difficulties that Indonesia has. Now, going back to your question, it's a really, really interesting one. So because Jokowi rose to the top of power so quickly, there were just 2 years between him being mayor of a city of 500,000 people and president of a nation of 200 million plus people. He actually didn't have many firm friends in national politics. That's really one of the things that was very different about him compared to, say, his predecessor, Susilo Bambang Yudhoyono, SBY, who had these advisors who were very close to him, who stayed with him through his presidency and even afterwards. And they were kind of like his brains trust. He could always turn to them. I think Jokowi really has a couple of people like that, chiefly Luhut Panjaitan, a former general who, like a lot of generals after the fall of Suharto, went into business in the resource sector. He actually also went into business with Jokowi in the mid-2000s, providing lumber from his plantations to Jokowi's furniture factory. That's how they met. And I think Luhut detected this talent that Jokowi had for retail politics. He backed his political campaigns. And we've seen Luhut really rise to be one of the most influential people in Jokowi's cabinet. His title is officially Coordinating Minister of Maritime Affairs, which sounds like a pretty irrelevant job, but he's actually minister for everything in many senses. He's leading on so many different diplomatic issues, political issues, investments, COVID vaccines. You name it, Luhut's there. But Jokowi likes to keep all his ministers on his toes, all his advisors on his toes, because having risen to the top so quickly, he's wary of these people trying to manipulate him. When he was elected president, I asked him what he would change in the presidential palace. Now he was no longer a mayor of a city. And he said, well, I'll try to do everything the same. But one thing I don't want is for the advisors, the ministers, to control me. I have to control them. So Jokowi kind of sits above the cabinet. One of his officials told me he's a bit like a king at court. So when the ministers do things right, Jokowi likes to take the credit for that. When they screw up, he sort of abandons them to the winds of misfortune and media critiques. So there's been a rotating cast of ministers. He likes mavericks, but they tend to get on his nerves after a while when they get too much press attention, when they seem too much like a rival. So even Luhut has had to be knocked down a peg or two at various points. Other flavors of the month at the moment, I would say Eric Thohir, who again has a quite technical sounding job, Minister of State-Owned Enterprises, but actually extremely influential on a wide range of issues, again, including broader economic management, dealing with COVID, looking for vaccines. So a very influential guy. He has Jokowi's ear at the moment, but Jokowi tends to cycle through these people. So we'll have to see where he is in a year or two's time.
Now, if I can turn to more domestic concerns here in Australia, if you're sitting in Sydney and looking out across the Tasman Sea, you might think that New Zealand is our closest neighbor, but it's actually Indonesia, and really important country for Australia. Could you kind of help us understand Australia-Indonesia relationships under Jokowi in particular?
Well, the first thing to understand is about Jokowi and foreign policy himself. It's hard to imagine another leader of a major G20 country, G20 democracy, who's as little interested in foreign policy as Jokowi. I mean, he sees it ultimately as a tool for his key focus, which is economic development, but he hates the formalities of ASEAN summits. He likes going to G20, to APEC in the days when you could physically go, the forums where there's more of an investment business focus, but he doesn't like formality. He's not interested in Indonesia stepping up in the Indo-Pacific, being a more active player in ASEAN, which is a stark contrast to SBY, his predecessor. So that's the first thing to understand, I think, in terms of understanding the Indonesia-Australia relationship under Jokowi. And now, having said that, I think the bilateral relationship is probably as good as it's ever been in a long time, in probably several decades. And the reason for that, I think, it's not Jokowi himself, but broadly the policy elites in both countries have come to understand the importance of deepening ties between both sides, and more importantly, developing mechanisms to manage the inevitable disputes that crop up when you have two countries that are so close but so different culturally, politically, economically, and socially. And I think on both sides, the foreign ministries and others have done a great job about learning what irritates the other side and giving them some leeway to upset each other, but not toxify the whole relationship and have the kind of hysterical responses we saw in the past with ambassadors withdrawn at the drop of a hat, really. And one of the markers of the good relationship was obviously Jokowi's state visit last year, addressing Parliament in Canberra, only the second Indonesian leader to do that after SBY. But more importantly, I think the enactment of the Indonesia-Australia Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, a broad-based trade and investment agreement, which was enacted in July last year. I think this agreement really says more about the nature of the bilateral relationship than it does about Indonesia's economic orientation. Indonesia is really quite a protectionist nation in many respects. It hasn't signed many trade agreements, bilateral trade agreements with G20 nations. It hasn't signed one for a long time. And I think this shows, after 10 years of really hard negotiations to get this over the line, there was a commitment in Indonesia to do something in Australia, with Australia, more than necessarily there was a commitment to suddenly get rid of the broad protectionist impulses that I think lie deep within the Indonesian political class and the broader body politic.
You bring to mind my recollection of the Jokowi speech before our parliament last February. I was honored to be there in Canberra to watch the speech. It was quite a remarkable speech in the parliament. And then a beautiful lunch afterwards inside Parliament House as well. It serves kind of as a bookend to the COVID era, because it was just days after that when things began to shut down. So let's turn to COVID if we could. What I realize that you mostly finished writing your book before the real impacts of COVID have hit, but would you draw some conclusions from what you've learned in your book to how Jokowi as a leader and how Indonesia as a country has responded to COVID thus far?
Well, the COVID-19 pandemic has shone an unflattering spotlight on all our political systems and our political leaders. Australia, for the most part, has come out pretty strongly. We've learned something about federalism in Australia that perhaps we didn't really realize before, the extent of state powers, etc. But broadly, Australia's come out pretty well. Certain other countries have done very poorly. So my home nation, the United Kingdom, the United States, where I think you're originally from, Gordon, and Indonesia, unfortunately, we'd have to put there as well. The Lowy Institute just produced a new index of COVID performance, looking at 99 countries across the world. Indonesia is there in 85th place, so really not great. There's been more than 1 million cases, more than 30,000 deaths, but Indonesia has one of the lowest testing rates in the world. And so most epidemiologists believe that the real extent of the pandemic is probably significant numbers times worse than the official figures. So it's been a real struggle for Indonesia. And I think what we've seen is that the pandemic has highlighted some of the worst traits of the Jokowi administration. So firstly, I'd say a lack of listening to experts, a disregard for expert advice. So Jokowi is really an impulsive leader. That's how he got to the top, his instincts for politics. But I think the flip side of that sort of instinctual approach is he doesn't like to listen to long technical explanations. And that makes it very difficult to manage a pandemic where you really have to listen to a lot of expert advice. You need political judgment and decisions too, but you have to listen first. And I think they haven't done that. I think there's really been a poor communication strategy to the Indonesian public, which again is another weakness. While he's personally good at connecting with people, his government is not good at consistent messaging. And I think there's been a lack of coherent strategy, which is linked to that weak messaging. And just the last thing I'd say is not really enough trust in Indonesian civil society and the Indonesian public. The government's tended to look to the police, to the military to kind of enforce their will rather than really bringing along the public, the many really great NGOs that are operating in Indonesia. So I think that's the negative. I guess the strength you would say is Jokowi has focused a lot on the economy. That's always his chief focus as president, as mayor beforehand. And I think he has genuinely worried that too much effort to mitigate the spread of the virus through things like lockdowns would harm the economy. And we have to remember that most Indonesians work in the informal sectors, doing things like day laboring, motorbike taxis, motorbike delivery people, domestic helpers, etc. So these people can't work from home in the way that you or I can. And I think Jokowi's had a genuine concern for those people and a fear that lockdowns would really hurt their incomes and not do enough to mitigate the virus. But I think the key challenge is there isn't an easy trade-off here. And until the virus is under control, it's unlikely that Indonesia's economy, which has slid, unfortunately, into its first recession since the Asian financial crisis, it's unlikely that it can recover until the virus is somehow under control. Jokowi's bet big on vaccines as the magic bullet. But given the difficulties of distributing them across Indonesia and the difficulties I think that all countries will face with new strains that may be virus resistant, I think you can't rely on vaccines alone. So I think it's understandable that he's worried about the economy. There hasn't been enough coherence there. But the good news is that at least they've kept financial stability. There was a fear at the beginning that the Indonesian rupiah, the banking system, would come under strain. He empowered his technocrats to take the right measures, for example, allowing the central bank to buy government debt. That really shored up external confidence in the Indonesian financial system, which I think was a good base level of technical response, but not really enough to answer kind of the next series of questions about where Indonesia goes from here.
Well, obviously, this is an issue that is not over. Hats off to your team there at the Lowy Institute. The index of international responses to COVID adds to the Asia Power Index and the ongoing Lowy poll. It's just a really, really invaluable tool in understanding the region. Although I might add, I would love to see an index created based on expectations or capacity. Right? So sure, Indonesia ranks below the United States and the United Kingdom, our two homelands. But if you look at where the UK and the US should be, I would argue that vis-a-vis where they actually are, they might actually fall below Indonesia in terms of the natural endowment they had going into the crisis, which they failed to utilize. But fascinating. Let's turn to another kind of more topical thing that took place after your book was published, and that was not a new thing in Indonesian politics, but this past December there was another cabinet reshuffle. What does that mean? What does that mean in the context of what you were just talking about in terms of COVID response and the economy in the coming days?
Well, it was something of an enforced cabinet reshuffle. It was a partial reshuffle. Only a handful of ministers were replaced, but two of them had to be replaced because they were under investigation for corruption. One particularly shameful or shameless episode, depending on the perspective, was the social affairs minister who's under investigation for corruption for stealing COVID-19 assistance funds that were meant for the poor. And I think that gets to the heart of the struggle that Jokowi's had to really build better processes of government. He has some good ideas about reforming the economy, but he's not very good at sort of changing the processes. But he had to replace a number of ministers. There was also the health minister who'd done a terrible job handling the pandemic in Indonesia at the start. He said that prayer would protect Indonesia. He was failing to distribute the funds that were allocated to help doctors, to help the health system respond. He hadn't helped to get the testing rate up to where it needed to be. So Jokowi was actually quite belated in moving him on. So I think he's brought in a couple of good people. The new health minister, Budi Sadikin, is a former banker, a former deputy minister for state-owned enterprises, who's a very competent technocrat. He's not a doctor, but I think he's not meant to be. He's there to make sure that the ministry works effectively. And he's actually reached out to epidemiologists, to the experts, trying to find the right answers. The problem he'll face is, Jokowi is breathing down his neck. I think initially he came into office, the health minister saying, this vaccination program realistically might take 3 or 4 years. Jokowi said that's not enough. Then the health minister said 15 months. Jokowi said, no, less than a year. I think that's going to be a real struggle. And so there's this tension when on the one hand, Jokowi's pushing people forward, but on the other hand, it's hard for them to have realistic goals. And if you don't have realistic goals, it's hard to make concrete progress. So that'll be interesting to see how he does. The other really interesting appointments were Tri Risma Harini, the former mayor of Surabaya, Indonesia's second most important city after Jakarta. She was actually a local leader somewhat in the Jokowi mold, someone who liked to go to see the problems with her own eyes. She has a reputation for shouting at civil servants who are screwing things up, not keeping the streets of Surabaya clean, or allowing people to hawk their goods in the wrong places. So she's been brought in as social affairs minister, which I think is a good move for her. And the other interesting one was Sandiaga Uno, a former businessman in his mid-40s, relatively youthful, very good at social media. He was actually the vice presidential candidate with Prabowo Subianto at the last election. And he joins Prabowo in Jokowi's cabinet. So this very peculiar trend in Indonesia that we see. We saw it with SBY2 for all presidents to build these big tent coalitions, including their former rivals. So now both the president and the vice president, obviously in the cabinet, but the former vice president and former presidential candidates also there, even though they bitterly fought a very hostile election with a lot of toxic propaganda thrown at either side on social media. And now both Sandiaga Uno and Prabowo in Jokowi's cabinet. So on the one hand, it shows Jokowi's good at building these broad coalitions. On the other hand, I think you have to question the effectiveness of having so many different people in the cabinet with such diverse views and backgrounds.
Well, you've listed a number of what you described as interesting developments. Let me put you on the spot and ask you then to look ahead. So what key developments, questions, trends, upcoming events, challenges do you see for the rest of this year for Indonesia that observers here in Australia and throughout the region should be paying attention to?
It's all about the pandemic, as it is for much of the world. So Jokowi, as I said earlier, has set this really ambitious goal to vaccinate 2/3 of the population. That's around 180 million people in less than a year. Obviously, each person needs to be vaccinated twice, according to the current vaccines. But Indonesia doesn't yet have access to anywhere near enough vaccines, a problem that many countries are facing, and obviously particularly developing countries, especially when they're as big as Indonesia, they have as many people. So I think he's been right in a sense to set a high target. It's going to be very hard to meet that. And the concern is that he's not doing enough. apart from vaccines, to try and get the pandemic under control. And until that happens, I think it'll be hard to get the economy motoring again. It'll be hard for Indonesia to open up its borders to other countries. Certainly Australia is not going to allow unfettered access to Indonesia until the pandemic is under control. So I think that's really the key task. Let's see how he does. Hopefully there is a bit of new blood in the cabinet. Hopefully they can push things in the right direction. I think that's really the big challenge that Indonesia faces. Some people are really worried about the situation. You know, you find that the security analysts always fear instability, social instability in Indonesia. They always fear radical Islam breaking out and some sort of collapse of the social order. On the other hand, you tend to find that the diplomats and the kind of business and investment folks have this other very rosy view of Indonesia. It's about to be the next tiger economy. It's going to take the leading role in Asia diplomatically as this empowered democracy, opening up the region to the rest of the world, politically and economically. And I think the reality tends to be, you know, disappointingly, but also reassuringly somewhere in the middle. And I like to fall back on this quote from my friend, the former finance minister, Hatib Basri, who used to say that Indonesia always disappoints. It disappoints the optimists, but it disappoints the pessimists too.
That's a wonderful quote. Hey, let me throw a kind of an unusual question at you to kind of wrap up. Your previous book was Generation Hong Kong, Seeking Identity in China's Shadow. Well received in too many respects, I think prophetic given the difficulties we've got going on there. I'm wondering if I could get you to tie your two books together. Is there any real strains between what's happening in Hong Kong now and what's happening in Indonesia, and how does Indonesia perceive those events?
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, just to start off, I'd say that, you know, the book I read about Hong Kong, it's probably the one thing I wrote that I wished would never come true. I wished I'd got it completely wrong, because it's just been bitterly depressing to see you know, how bad things have got. Quite a number of the people, the young activists, young politicians I interviewed in the book are now in prison. Others have gone into exile. So it's really a miserable situation. I just hope that here in Australia and around the rest of the world, governments do all they can to help individuals who are affected, who are struggling to get by in these really difficult days in Hong Kong. Moving back to the books, I mean, obviously Hong Kong and Indonesia are very, very different places, but I think there are some similar issues. I mean, the first and most obvious is, in a way, the struggle to live in the shadow of Xi Jinping's China. I mean, clearly Hong Kong is part, and always has been since 1997 anyway, we can debate about before then, part of the People's Republic of China, but it had a separate political system, it had a separate social system, and I think Indonesia, in many ways, is further away from China. It has a lot more space, but there's a similar sense of how are we going to live with a nation like China under Xi Jinping that's ever more assertive, ever more aggressive, has a very different way of looking at the world. So I think there's a shared struggle there in one sense. The other thing that really interests me is kind of the role of young people who are really in Hong Kong at the forefront of the pushback against Beijing, and they really help to transform, you know, a lot of views among more moderate older people in Hong Kong society, which I think is fascinating. Elsewhere around the world, you know, youth activism tends to fizzle out, right? The people who sit in their tents outside the banks in Wall Street or the City of London usually end up working for those banks, working for the government, working for the management consultancies, or God forbid, the think tanks like ours. I'm not saying I was ever a young radical, I wasn't. But what fascinated me in Hong Kong was that didn't happen. These young people kind of stuck to their goals and a great personal cost. And one of the things we've seen emerge in Indonesia is that as the space for opposition in Indonesia has narrowed, partly because so many of the political parties have joined Jokowi's government, and partly because I think the authorities have increasingly looked to persecute opposition activists. They've looked to narrow the space for critical journalism and NGOs. You have seen this renewed youth movement in Indonesia, really for the first time since 1998. We've seen young people protesting against Jokowi's moves to curb the power of the Independent Anti-Corruption Commission. We've seen them protesting against racism, against Papuan people in Indonesia. So I think there's an interesting trend emerging there that's similar in both countries, of young people standing up against the odds, to try and fight for rights, for freedoms, to try and raise their voice. And I think that is an interesting trend, although you would hope that it wasn't necessary, especially in Indonesia, where many people hoped that the democracy was moving in the right direction. Unfortunately, things are getting difficult, but it's good to see that young people are there, standing up, expressing, their opinions and pushing back at a time when it's difficult.
I have to confess, on a personal level, there's something almost cathartic about reading your two books, because to use the words that you quoted at the very end from Muhammad Chatir Basri, right? If you look at Indonesia today, yes, there are some real challenges, and you've laid them out very well, both in the book and in our conversation today. But there's also this underlying faith that they will continue to disappoint the pessimists. And so, hey, what a wonderful conversation. We could go on, but for those of you who haven't read it, Ben's book, Man of Contradictions, Joko Widodo and the Struggle to Remake Indonesia, is available on the Lowy Institute website and on Amazon and other places, I presume, where if you just Google it, it's not hard to find. But I hope you'll take a chance to read it, to better understand developments in our nearest neighbor. And Ben, we look forward to engaging with you during the course of this year, as not just Indonesia, but Australia deal with the challenges of the COVID era and the required re-emergence, reintegration, economic recovery that has to come. Thank you for your time. Greatly appreciated.
Thanks, Gordon. And yeah, hopefully our two states can improve their bilateral relationship to the point where we can meet in person soon as well.
Indeed, thanks.